So her talk tonight will focus on key findings from her analysis of the human remains at Portmahomack and reveal insights into the lives of the Pictish and medieval communities at that site. Without further ado, I'll hand over to her, and hopefully screen sharing will work and all will be great. I'm sure we're going to have a fascinating talk.
Thank you, Alistair. Just give me a couple of minutes while I share screen and get everything sorted. Okay, yes, ready to go. You can see that okay, can you? The main PowerPoint. Lovely. Right. Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, Alistair, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk for Groam House Museum. And apologies for those who booked tickets back in December, originally when I was supposed to give the talk. Unfortunately, I was visited by that unwanted friend, COVID. But we're here tonight, and thank you all very much for coming. And as Alistair said, this talk will be centered on some of the key finds from my osteological analysis. Not really talking about the stable isotopes, but the osteological analysis on the human remains from Portmahomack. So just a brief outline. I'll be giving a general background on bioarchaeology. There's many of these terms thrown about: bioarchaeology, paleopathology, osteology. So hopefully you'll have a better idea of what that means in a moment. And just a very brief overview of the site of Portmahomack. I'm sure you're all very familiar with it already, so I won't go into too much detail about that. But what I want to do is cover two key areas. I want to present some cases of interpersonal violence that span several centuries at Portmahomack. And I then want to go on to talk about health and well-being and disease of the children from Portmahomack's past. So giving them a voice, the adults get enough attention as it is. So just to forewarn you that this talk will include images of skeletal human remains. And later on, I'll be talking about evidence of prenatal death, mother and child death in labour. So I'm just forewarning you of that also. So human bioarchaeology, this is the study of archaeological human remains, and it encompasses multidisciplinary approaches. Bioarchaeologists assess human skeletons to determine the sex of the skeleton, estimate their age at death, their stature, and identify markers of disease and trauma on the skeleton. Isotope analysis may be conducted to reconstruct diet and mobility. Further to that, DNA analysis may be done for kinship or disease diagnosis. And we do this to reconstruct and understand past lifeways, how people interacted with each other, with their environments, and how socioeconomic, religious, and political influences may have had an effect on their bodies through subsistence, lifestyle, occupation, for example. So paleopathology is the study of disease and trauma on past people. It's not that these diseases don't exist anymore, they do, such as leprosy, TB, but this is the particular study on how these diseases and trauma affected people from the past. So we examine skeletons to determine what is classed as normal or expected variation on the skeleton. So for example, differences in stature and body proportions. And this is compared to abnormal, what is not expected, from infectious diseases to accidental or even intentional trauma on the body. Now, despite what you may see from these TV programs, it's extremely rare to be able to determine the cause of death on the skeleton. This may only tell us part of the story when we see abnormal markers on the skeleton. So for example, if we see a bone with infection, we can't say that that individual had an infectious disease. Can be quite frustrating at times, but we'll come on to that later. So there's a wealth of historical and archaeological methods that enable us to reconstruct past lifeways. Archaeological investigations give us vital clues with discoveries of habitation, occupation, subsistence, communication, and even commemoration. For example, the use and reuse of material culture, and one most recent and excellent example of that is the common Pictish stone found near Dingwall. That was reused as a grave marker in the 18th century. But then we have the mortuary evidence, we have grave goods, the burial type themselves, the location, the zonation of burials, where children buried within a cemetery, on the periphery, or outside of a cemetery, for example. This may tell us about religion, status, how people were perceived in life or in death by the manner of their burial. And then, of course, we have historical records. For example, bills of mortality that list the cause of death, or medical text. So these are not always a direct indicator of how one lived or indeed died, even when written about specific people sometimes, but they are an important source of to understand these wider context. So the study of bioarchaeology encompasses a range of different forms of disciplines and evidence to be able to reconstruct past lifeways. So I'm just going to give a quick run through of the site and the burials. As I say, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, and I know there are some friends and colleagues in the audience who are more than familiar with this. So it's just a very quick overview. So archaeological investigations were carried out at Portmahomack between 1994 and 2007, and the site was excavated by FAS Heritage under the direction of Professor Martin Carver. If you've not checked out the latest monograph yet, do so, please. It's available for free digital download from the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland website. So it's free for you to access there. So a wealth of discoveries were found from the site, far too many for me to mention here, but some include Pictish stones, remains of fauna and flora, evidence of glass, metal, leather working, evidence of weaving, food processing, butchery and grain storage. It was all going on at Portmahomack. There were dedicated workshops, for example, in the later medieval period, evidence of fish processing on a larger scale. In the early medieval period, there is evidence of a dedicated vellum working area. And that, along with key finds such as bone styli and rare evidence of Latin inscriptions on one of the stones, suggest bookmaking and scribing was a key activity at the monastery. And some of you may remember Victoria's talk from a few weeks ago about whether the Book of Kells was made at Portmahomack. So the burials themselves, stratigraphic and radiocarbon evidence from the burials reveal 5 different periods, so periods 1 to 5, and 178 burials were assessed from this. The 178 burials comprise of 138 adults and 40 non-adults. These skeletons were originally assessed by Sarah King back in 2000, and then as part of a wider study for my PhD, I included them with isotope analysis and comparing to other sites as well. So periods 1, 2 and 3 contain mainly adult burials, with period 4 and 5 containing the adult and non-adult burials. More about the children later. The burial type shifted from stone-lined kist and head support burials to coffin and or shroud burials. And this reflects changing mortuary and religious practices over time at the site. So as I said, with period 1, we have this Pictish lay phase. This MF question mark and C just relates to male, female, sex unknown, and children, because children can't be sexed. So we don't know whether they were boys or girls, they're children. And this is the number at each phase. So at the Pictish phase, there were no children, just 9 males and 4 females. Some of the graves were west-east aligned. Potentially, they could have been on the cusp of converting to Christianity by this phase, but this was not the phase of the monastic community. That's in period 2, where we have a predominantly male community. 2 female burials were found and 1 child non-adult burial. And this is intriguing. So were the females married or related to any of the monastic brethren? Or were they domestic staff at the monastery? No, I'm not too sure about that. Was the child a relative or an oblate at the monastery? There's not really any evidence that ablation was practiced in early medieval Scotland. Well, none that I found anyway. If you found some, wonderful, do let me know. But at other sites, such as Inchmarnock, for example, there's archaeological evidence that suggests there was an 8th to 9th century monastic schoolhouse where pupils were instructed in writing and illustration. However, one child at the monastic phase at Portmahomack does not make a monastic school. So it's very intriguing to do further assessment on this child to see what we can glean from that. We then have in period 3, Scoto-Norse period, a small-scale trading farm with possible remnants of a monastic community there. But there's a hiatus where I'll come on to that later. I'm jumping ahead of myself. I'll tell you why later. Then we have the late medieval parish church community. This is more of a normal family demographic with men, women and children. The children mostly burials from the 15th to 16th century roundabouts. And then we have the later post-medieval period. This is mostly child burials. Only 2 adults were found in this phase. And the 2 adults were buried in the north aisle of the church beneath a plaque dedicated to William Mackenzie, who was minister at the Tarbert parish between 1638 and 1642. So these 2 adult burials are thought to be Minister Mackenzie and his wife. So I'm going to move on to the first theme about trauma on some of the adult burials. Now, the cause of death is unknown for most of the Portmahomack skeletons, but there are several individuals that had inflicted trauma on them. And this gives us vital clues and insights into interpersonal violence and the wider socio-political sphere in the Scottish Highlands that spans several centuries. So first we have 2 adult males from the Pictish monastery at Portmahomack. And what we have here is on the skull, on the top of the cranium, we have sharp force trauma on the 2 individuals. This one on the left, adult male aged 26 to 35 years, radiocarbon dated to around 780 to late 900s. So what we have here is 3 blade wounds, and all were unhealed, which means that either this individual died from these wounds, or it could have been something else, a trauma, fatal trauma to soft tissue. We just don't know what the cause of death was. But what we do know is that this individual did not survive these cuts. They were unhealed at the time of death. The scenario here could be he was attacked from behind. This is the back of the head. This is the front. Attacked from behind with a deep cut to the back, then a glancing blow across there, and then a final blow across the top. In contrast, this individual, an adult male, somewhat older, age 46 to 59 at death, also had 2 blade wounds. But here, what you see is that these blade wounds are healed. So this individual survived this attack. And as a side note, this individual also had several left rib fractures as well, and they were healed. Okay, so these cuts to this individual had healed before death, as did the rib fractures. So one died from these wounds or something else, but died shortly around the time of these wounds, and the other survived. So these individuals are thought to be victims of a Viking raid at Portmahomack around the late 8th, 9th century AD. The archaeological evidence suggests a fire that swept through the workshop area, deliberate smashing and dumping of sculptures, and the osteological evidence, such as this, is quite rare to find evidence or primary skeletal evidence of Viking attacks on monastic brethren. We know it's in the historical records, and we see the archaeological evidence, but it's very rare to see the osteological evidence on the skeletons themselves. So the scenario with the individual with the heel trauma could be either this monk fought off his attacker, or the Vikings' primary objective simply wasn't to kill. They were there for the wealth. They went to these monasteries for the wealth, not to just simply kill everybody. And as you may know, the Vikings sacked Lindisfarne in 793 and at Iona in 795, and a number of times thereafter. And the recurring opinion that Iona's monastic community was wiped out by Viking attacks has recently been referred to as the zombie narrative by Dr. Adrian Maldonado and colleagues. They argue that archaeological and historical evidence suggests activity continued at Iona and other monastic sites such as Hodham. And this seems to be what happened at Portmahomack. Activity did continue somewhat after the raid, albeit on a smaller scale. Fast forward to the 12th and 13th centuries, the area of Easter Ross was still under Norse control during this time, with the nearby earldom of Caithness being ruled by Harold Madadison around 1158 to 1206, which stretched as far down as Murray. Now, this is when clan warfare truly emerged and violent encounters became the norm. Religious leaders weren't immune to this violence either. For example, Bishop John of Caithness was blinded and mutilated by Harold Madadison in 1199. By the 13th century, the Exetersis Scoticanus, also known as the Scottish Army or the Common Army, was often summoned to call on large numbers of men to make up the bulk of the infantry fighters to fight for the Scottish cause of independence. These armies were made up of not just experienced warriors, but inexperienced poor farmers or unfree men, many of whom had no idea how to fight or defend themselves. And this is worth bearing in mind when we move on to some of these examples. So the next case is from the 12th to 13th century, and this is an adult male who was aged 36 to 45 years at death. What occurred of this individual was several blade wounds to different areas of the body, all unhealed at the time of death, so he did not survive these cuts. So you have cuts to the left side of the head, and also a cut to the back of the left thigh, just under the buttock there, and the back of the right thigh as well. So cuts from different angles, from the front and the side and the back. So potentially he could have been slain by more than one assailant, or he was slain face on and then turned around to run, and he was cut down from behind as well. We simply don't know. So we can't say for certain whether this individual was called on to fight in a battle, but with civil wars, clan battles and skirmishes being endemic during this time, it is possible. This individual also had a heel fracture on one of the bones on his right hand, and it's around this area on the bottom of the palm of the hand. If you can see my hand, I can't see myself on the camera, sorry, but on the bottom of the palm of the hand was where the bone was fractured. This type of injury is commonly caused by heavy forces on the hand whilst holding a hard object. So the question is, was this individual a seasoned fighter or an experienced man not knowing how to hold a sword correctly? It's a wild assumption, but that's one scenario. The next case is from the 13th, 15th century, and this is an adult male aged 36 to 45. What occurred here was a blade wound to the back of the head, and then fractures on a number of different bones on the body. So he had a blade wound here, and then fractures on several left ribs, on his lower leg, on the fibula on the left side, had a fracture. And just as a side note, on the right fibula, there's evidence of heel rickets. So it suggests this child had some form of vitamin deficiency during childhood. On his right hand, just below the thumb area, he had a fracture to that bone. This is a common fracture when punching with a clenched fist. And on his right wrist, he also had a fracture in one of the bones, one of the carpal bones. On his left hand, he had two bones in his middle finger that have fused together. This could possibly be due to trauma as well. And amazingly, all this trauma had healed before death. Okay, so all these were not the cause of death, they had healed. So does this suggest that this individual is a seasoned fighter, someone who knew how to defend himself? Again, we can't say, but it's one plausible explanation. So in the 15th and 16th centuries, clan warring increased and coincided with intensification of cattle raiding and iron production. Archaeological evidence of iron production has been found at Portmahomack and at Dunnon Castle by FAS Heritage. And this suggests that activities of forging heavy-bladed weapons to meet the demands of increased battles across Scotland, and it occurs at a number of other sites as well. The next case is a really special case. This is a large grave containing two adult males in an oak coffin, so it's this one here. And this was discovered in the nave by the crypt. So this is the crypt here. And what was also found was a small infant coffined burial at the foot of this grave. The primary burial, the burial that went in the grave first, burial 36, was an adult male aged 46 to 59. You'll see they're all around the age of 36 to 45 and 46 to 49. So these are mature men. And he was the tallest of all males from all periods, and he stood at 5'11". So he's the tallest of them all. Now, sometime after, when the body had skeletonized, this depends on temperature, climate, so on, environment. That could be from a number of months to a couple of years. But when the body was skeletonized, the grave was reopened and the second body was placed on top sometime after. That is burial 30, and he was aged 36 to 45 at death. Now, what's intriguing about this burial is that 4 skulls were also placed in here with the primary burial, first burial. And they are 3 adult males and 1 adult female. This is a really unusual rite for medieval Christian burials. So what was happening there? So a recent project led by Cecily Spall at FAS Heritage includes a wealth of exciting new results from radiocarbon dating, ADNA analysis and facial reconstruction to shed more light on this special burial. But first, the trauma. So the primary burial, burial 36, had evidence of a fatal blade wound across the right cheek and a glancing blow across down and just above the left eye. Both cuts were not healed. Okay, so they were unhealed cuts. So these happened at or around the time of death. Okay, most likely the cause of death. Now, I was hoping this individual was a contender for the Battle of Tarbet around 1486, or the Battle of Algeciras, 1487, between the clans Ross and the clan Mackay. But the radiocarbon results predate these events, so never mind. Now, new radiocarbon dates from SWERC and ADNA results from Harvard University have yielded fascinating results. And thanks again to Cecily for sharing this information with me. Now, the majority of the remains date from the mid-13th to the mid-15th century. And what we have here is the 2 main burials. They are thought to be related, and a number of the other skulls are thought to be related in one way or another. Now, I'm not a DNA expert, so I'm not going to try and interpret this too much, but what I believe the results are is, or one possible scenario, is that burial 30 and burial 36 were more than third degree relatives, so possibly paternal great half uncle nephew, either way. This skull, 290, was potentially half brother to the burials. And then we have the potential mother-son relationship between this skull here and burial 30, so mother-son relationship. And what's most surprising is this one here, this skull 327. This was dated to the Pictish monastic phase. So potentially a relic placed in the grave with these other ancestors. So what this shows is a rare evidence of kinship as well as ancestral and religious veneration in the mortuary record at Portmahomack. Extremely unusual burial, to say the least. And this is the face of burial 30, the second individual that was placed in that grave. The faces of Scotland's past people are emerging from a range of wonderful projects in using fantastic revolutionary new methods for facial reconstruction. So for example, at the University of Bradford, my colleague Dr Adrian Evans scanned the two skulls from the burial, 3D scanning, and then Face Lab at Liverpool John Moores University did this wonderful digital facial reconstruction of that. So that is burial 30. And then we have other wonderful examples of this as well. We have Blair Athol man and Rose Markey man, facial reconstructions of which have been fairly recently revealed. And there are more to come. There are more facial reconstructions, and I'm not sure if I can say any more than that at a couple of sites in Scotland. So we'll wait for those releases. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the children of Portmahomack's past, and I just want to thank Arena Richards. She did these lovely 2 drawings for me. I asked her, could she just do a drawing of a Pictish child, even though we're not really talking about Pictish children, but there's just nothing out there that I could find, or not much anyway. So Arena did a lovely job of these 2. So thanks to Arena. And again, just to forewarn you that I will be talking about childhood death in this next section. So this is just one of many views on the importance of studying the skeletal remains of children from the past. Now, there's still a huge gap in our understanding of past childhood health and well-being in Scotland. There's more stuff being done in England and Ireland, but there's not much being done in Scotland, and that's partly because there's not as many skeletal assemblages, and Portmahomack is a really rare opportunity to be able to analyse the skeletal remains of children. And it's just as important to assess the health relationships between the mother and the child, not just the children themselves. So these skeletal remains give us primary evidence for past life ways of children, but they are often overlooked in favour of focusing on adult remains. So tonight I want to give the children a voice and just put the adults aside for a bit. We also have other sources to draw on, obviously archaeological examples, which I'll come on to in a moment as well, but also historical texts give some useful insights. Sometimes these can be obviously biased towards important people or events, and the children of lower echelons of society are almost invisible from such evidence. But we do have some useful sources to draw on. So what do we mean by childhood? And how can we quantify this and place it into a historical context? So osteologists assess skeletons to determine chronological age with a cutoff point for non-adults. And when I say non-adults, I mean children. So non-adults around 17 to 18 years. Okay, so up to that age, classed as a non-adult. After that age, an adult. The biology and the physiology influences how we age skeletal remains. So, for example, the stages when their bones stop fusing, and that occurs around different stages during childhood and for some bones into early adulthood. So the biology can, but not always, influence social age as well. So social age, for example, the age of majority, when one is deemed an adult, in the modern Western world, this coincides with physical attributes associated with when growth ceases, when the child stops growing. And that means they are legal to drive, drink, work, have sex, so on. In antiquity, the age of majority could occur before the cessation of growth, but marked by signs of adulthood. So, for example, the start of puberty, the start of menstruation, and so on. In the medieval period, for example, children would work as soon as they were able and could marry between the ages of 10 to 14 years, although this was not the universal norm. They would normally marry in their later teens or early 20s. So being an adult could be determined by cultural or physiological attributes independent of the age of the child. In other words, a child's biological age may have no bearing on their social age in the past. So if I was to assess a skeleton and I give it an age of around, let's say 12 to 14 years of age, biologically, osteologically, that is classed as a non-adult. However, when you place that in their social context, they may have been deemed adult, contributing to their society, contributing to their community, their family, and so on and so forth. So we do need to bear that in mind. I'm only going to show you two graphs this evening, you'll be pleased to know, one of which is just a very general graph to show that from the 40 non-adults, the highest child mortality was within the first year of life. And this is something that we need to bear in mind later on as well. As you see, there's more of an even spread with the older children and a couple of smaller numbers either side. But this is the intriguing one, the birth to 1 year of age. 30% of the children this accounts for. So can we tease out any reasons for this? Let's see if we can. This graph shows that the child mortality was variable across Scotland, and I'd just like to say thank you to Marlo Willows, who did a fantastic PhD at the University of Edinburgh, for sharing some of her data with me. Now, there are some differences in mortality rates between rural and urban sites, as you can see, but there are similarities too. So it's not a clear case of those in rural settings having a better health than those in urban. These sites have a wide geographical and temporal span from early medieval to early modern periods, so variation is expected. There would have been many factors such as changing climate, poor environment, socioeconomic status, cultural and even religious influences would have all had a part to play in child health and well-being, and such influences would have differed from location to location. So the osteological analysis gives us direct evidence and may elucidate what factors influenced child mortality. So the next few cases provide a mere snapshot of child health from Portmahomack from the osteological evidence. So of the 14 children assessed, 19, so that's nearly half of the children from Portmahomack, had evidence of skeletal pathologies, some of whom had more than one type. Okay, not always severe, but more than one type nevertheless. The child at the Pictish monastery had no pathologies whatsoever, so we won't be discussing that individual here. The highest prevalence was found in iron and nutritional deficiencies. And unusually, very few had dental pathologies. They had really good teeth. There were just two that had caries, so cavities in the teeth. Just one had an abscess and one had what's known as dental enamel hyperplasia. So this is an interesting one. This suggests that the child was poorly when these teeth were developing, because what happens is the teeth start to form at the crown and then form all the way up incrementally into the root. But what happens if the child is poorly while these teeth are forming is that you get an interruption in that formation, and it causes these lines on the teeth. So that one child from this dental pathology, it suggests that they were poorly when these teeth were being formed. And what we also need to remember is sugar is not a native plant to Britain, so they weren't consuming sugar at that time. It was imported into Britain and in Scotland around the 16th century, but it was only consumed by those of very high status, you know, the nobility, the elite, those who could afford it. So it wouldn't have been consumed by the lower echelons of society or everyday people. So this is potentially why we're not seeing many dental pathologies. Honey wouldn't have caused as much damage as sugar would. Okay. So I'm just going to focus on a few of the pathologies in the next few cases. I'm afraid I haven't got time to go through all of them from the collection, but these are some of the most interesting key cases. So bones are covered in a dense layer of vascular connective tissue called the periosteum. So you have the bone here, and then you have the periosteal layer, and then you have the muscle and the skin and so on and so forth. Now, when this becomes infected, either through disease or through trauma, it lays down new bone on the affected area. Now, this can be a consequence of infectious disease, such as leprosy or TB, only when accompanied by specific changes to the bone. So, for example, changes to the bones of the face with lepromatous leprosy, or changes to the spine with TB. In the absence of those specific bone changes, we call it non-specific infection to denote an unknown cause. So what we have here is 2 children from Portmahomack had this non-specific infection. We don't know what caused it, but what we do know is that it was still active at the time of death. So that means that the infection was still ongoing when the child died. So they hadn't recovered from that infection. And we have a mixture of both. We have a mixture of a healed infection and an unhealed infection. So it was a continuous reoccurrence of that infection. So here you have these darker areas, and these are the unhealed periosteal new bone infection on the this is on the lower leg, the fibula of the older child. So it affected a 3-year-old child and a 15-year-old child. So the 3-year-old child had healed new bone on the lower legs. So this is the blue ones here we're looking at, and on the lower legs and on the upper legs as well. No other pathologies to determine the cause of that. The 15-year-old child, the older child, had healed new bone on the inside of both lower legs, so the red stars here, and active new bone, again, the infection was still active on the outside of the right lower leg. So essentially what that means is that these children had ongoing infection on their legs, okay? We don't know the cause, but we can have a guess. We'll come on to that in a moment. Infectious disease. This is a possible case, big question mark here. This is a possible case of TB on a child around 11 to 15 years of age, dating to the late 13th to early 15th century. Now, what was found on this individual was a destructive lesion on the frontal bone. So the front of the skull on the right-hand side have this lytic lesion that's eaten through the outer layer of the bone on the cranium, and also had active bone on the lower right thigh, on the back, but also on a number of different other bones as well, all over the place. Effective new bone on all arm bones, on the hands, and on the scapulae, on the shoulder blades. Okay, so not just an isolated case here. Now, as I say, possible TB, but without that changes to the spine, that deviation in the spine, we can't say for certain whether it is pulmonary TB, for example. An alternative diagnosis could be some form of metastatic cancer. They have similar changes. There is difference, but this lesion could have started, the child could have died shortly after these lesions started. So we can't differentiate between the type of lesion and the cause. Another disease that causes these type of lesions is venereal syphilis. And I think it's highly unlikely that this would have been the cause for this child. However, we can't rule it out completely because they do have similar manifestations. But considering the age of the child and the period, I think I'm happy to rule this out until I'm proven wrong. For example, the earliest recording of venereal syphilis is from an Aberdeen ordinance of 1497. And that postdates the age of this child. Okay, so possibly TB with a secondary diagnosis of metastatic cancer. So animals were present in or very close to many houses during this period and could be a source of trauma and or infection to the children. Humans can catch bovine TB through eating infected dairy or meat or inhaling mucus or fecal pathogens. So was this the case with the child with suspected TB, if indeed the child did have bovine TB, for example, and for the other children as well with the infected legs? They may simply have just had an accident and cut their legs and infection set in. But considering it's on more than one bone, I think there's other causes than that. The 3-year-old child, the younger child, all these blue stars here where the infection was all over the legs, may have been susceptible to infection from a bacterial source through lack of hygiene or environmental pathogens, for example. This is another very unusual case. This is a child that was merely a few months old, yet there was evidence of new bone lesions, some active, again, still ongoing. The infection was still ongoing at the time of death on some of the left and right ribs. So where the pleural cavity is against the ribs, respiratory infection, and the infection adheres new bone to the inside of those ribs. And this suggests acute respiratory infection. The potential diagnosis, so either lower respiratory infection or pneumonia. Pneumonia could be likely if due to an underlying cause such as congenital heart disease or low birth weight, possibly brought on by poor health of the mother. And we're going to touch on this again in a bit. So respiratory disease may have been due to excessive indoor smoke inhalation. For example, in a typical black house, the floor was generally flagstoned or covered in packed earth, and there was a central hearth for the fire. There was no chimney for the smoke to escape through. Instead, the smoke would escape through the roof and through small windows and obviously the door, if open. The mother may have been breastfeeding the child in a smoky environment for long periods of time during the first few months of life. And this is especially plausible if the child was born in the winter when the doors and windows were kept closed more often. So the child would be breastfeeding, and during that time, they're inhaling the smoke in the house and therefore breathing that in, and that's caused the respiratory infection. It's one plausible account for that. Another condition, vitamin deficiency. Scurvy is caused by vitamin C deficiency, so we find that in fresh fruit and vegetables. Now, contrary to popular belief, scurvy is not a deficiency restricted to sailors on long voyages. Overcooking or long periods of food storage can destroy essential vitamins. And there's also potential danger of increased susceptibility to illness when the child is weaned off the highly nutritious breast milk too soon. Now, 6 children at Portmahomack were affected with scurvy, all between the ages of birth to 1 year, so within the first few months of life. So one would expect them to have been breastfeeding at that time, as would be common in that period. So either they were not being breastfed, or the mothers were themselves nutritionally deficient and unable to give adequate nutrition to the child. Another vitamin deficiency is vitamin D, and that results in a condition you may be familiar with called rickets. We find vitamin D from our diet in fish oil and animal fats, but we get up to 90% of vitamin D from the sunlight on our skin. If deficient in this, it results in lack of mineral in the bones, and the mineral provides the strength and rigidity of the bone. So if that is depleted, it means when the child is trying to crawl or walk, these bones are soft and they start to bend. And that is what a result is of that. Now, this is more common in later industrial periods due to lack of sun exposure on the skin of children. So children who were working from dawn till dusk indoors in mines and mills and so on. So the children that were affected at Portmahomack, 3 children had rickets. Again, all within a breastfeeding age. So 2 were aged between birth to 1, and 1 was aged between 1 and 2 years of age. So all within 2 years of age, which is still expected at the time to have been breastfed. Now, in the medieval period, this could have been due to inadequate nutrition. Again, the mother may have been poorly, or lack of sun exposure to the child. It was common to swaddle babies. And unfortunately, mothers thought that by swaddling babies, that would help the child's limbs grow straight. Unfortunately, it was doing more damage than good. Now, there's not much evidence of rickets from medieval Scottish assemblages, especially of children this young. There's one possible case found at the Isle of May, and I'm sure there's more occurring, but I need to find out where they are. But these cases at Portmahomack seem quite unusual. It's not common at that time. So, iron deficiency. Now, there's different forms of iron deficiency, and they can manifest as porosity in the eye sockets or on the cranium. And when it occurs in the eye socket, you may just be able to see these small little holes here. This is only a minimal occurrence of that. This is called cribra orbitalia. And 6 children at Portmahomack were affected with this. A range of ages, so from 1 fetus right through to 10 years of age, were affected by this condition. The causes may include intestinal parasitic infections or excessive blood loss, but unfortunately these can't be detected on the skeleton. Other causative factors to think about are soil and fecal pathogens as a result of agricultural practices and proximity to animals, as I mentioned before, or poor sanitation, or the health of the mother again, or a combination of all of those. There's one comparable on a fetus of this condition from a disarticulated context from St Nicholas Kirk in Aberdeen. But it's very rare to see this condition on fetal remains. You do see it on older children, but not on fetal remains. And it suggests maybe some mother-child health imbalance. So evidence of the presence of iron deficiency on the fetus is rare in the archaeological record, as I've just mentioned, as are obstetric burials. So I'm going to focus on this important case a little bit further, but I want to just forewarn you that this next phase will discuss prenatal death of mother and child. So if this is something you feel you don't want to look at, feel free to switch off for the next 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, so an obstetric burial was discovered at Portmahomack with the fetal remains still within the pelvic cavity. You may just be able to make out the ribs here. The age of the mother was 26 to 35 years of death, and the fetal age was 20 to 33 weeks. So that's around 5 to 8 months in utero. So premature labour could have begun at any point of this stage. Now, some pathologies were found on the mother, but mostly in the form of herniated discs on the spine. So what that is between each vertebra, you have these sort of squishy intervertebral discs. And due to excessive heavy forces on the spine over repetitive activity, for example, this then can cause the spine to contract to a point where the discs burst. and they herniate. And then they punch a hole into the bone and create these lesions on the vertebra. And this mother had a number of vertebral columns affected. So the thoracic, so in the middle of the back, essentially. Now, the problem was the whole of this skeleton could not be recovered. So it was only the torso and arms that were recovered. So there may be pathologies that have been lost from the skull, for example, or from the legs, but we just don't know. Undernutrition and excessive work, however, remember, heavy forces on this individual's spine, may have had a direct impact on her unborn child. For example, this is the child with iron deficiency in the eye sockets, cribra orbitalia. Okay. The other consequence is, in the medieval period, another treatment for poorly pregnant women was to bloodlet, okay, to rebalance the humours. So if a pregnant woman was feeling ill, it was thought her humours were imbalanced, and to rebalance those humours, bloodletting would be needed. Now, of course, this would be detrimental to the mother's iron levels during pregnancy, and females during pregnancy, their iron levels are depleted, or it's common for their iron levels to become depleted. So that, on top of bloodletting, may have been another cause for this iron deficiency in the unborn child. Now, the fetus was in what's called a transverse lie position, which means unless a baby turns spontaneously, or external or internal version, meaning that externally you grab the baby's head and manipulate the head and body around so it's engaged in the right position. Unless that is done, natural delivery would have been impossible with this position. Now, this is easily overcome today, but in the past it could have proven fatal, especially if a highly experienced midwife was not present. So if labour had begun, the most likely cause would have been uterine rupture due to obstructed labour, resulting in antepartum hemorrhage. So essentially, severe bleeding and circulatory shock would have occurred. Now, this can be an upsetting conversation to have in terms of the skeletal remains and the health or poor health of the mother and the death of the mother and child. However, this rare evidence is vital to our understanding of the health of pregnant women in the past and mother-child health relationships. So we really need to start having more dialogue about this in archaeological discourse. We may also draw interpretations from historical sources. So, for example, the old statistical accounts of Scotland, recorded in 1791, a lack of midwives in Kilturn in Ross and Cromarty. It was noted with concern that pregnant mothers, and I quote, seldom have proper assistance when in childbed, as there is no regularly bred midwife in the parish. This often proves of fatal consequence to women in that situation, which, of all others, require the most tender care as well as skill, end quote. So evidence of inadequate midwifery care from the historical record, combined with the archaeological evidence and the osteological evidence of this complex pregnancy, goes some way to shed light on the fatal consequences of childbirth around this time in Scotland, and in this case in the Highlands. From an archaeological perspective, however, this seems to be the exception and not the rule. There are very few obstetric burials found from the archaeological record. So this is another very rare case found at Portmahomack. So there are multiple factors that affect birth and mortality outcomes, which I've previously mentioned, including socioeconomic status, poor sanitation, environment, inadequate diet and health of the mother, disease brought on by animal or soil pathogen transmission, so on and so forth. We still have a long way to go to give the children of Scotland's past a voice, but research like this and more open dialogue is needed to understand mother-child health and well-being in the past and contribute to similar concerns in today's society. What we do know is that the people of Portmahomack still have much to reveal. And thank you very much for listening.